Welcome to the Double D Podcast with your host, Double D.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Season 2 of the Double D Podcast. I'm very excited actually today because today is the 550th anniversary of Guru Nanak Dev Ji's birth. And for those of you who don't know, Guru Nanak Dev Ji is the founder of the Sikh religion. And it's a very historic movement, actually, not only from a religious standpoint, but also from a political and historical standpoint, because what's happened is as people know, there's the India and Pakistani border, and there is only a few acres only dividing, one of the most religious, holiest places where Guru Nanak Dev Ji actually spent his remaining years before he died, called Kartarpur. And what they've done, the Pakistani government under Prime Minister Imran Khan, what they've done is they've actually opened up a corridor and made it really beautiful so that Sikh pilgrims from India can cross over. And today, which is the November 9th, if you were to see on TV, there was a really great celebration, and it was the first time, I think, if I'm not wrong, it's the first time I think after 47 anything like this has happened. So anyhow, it's an amazing night. Obviously, I'm from a Sikh background, so this means a lot to me, and I have my dear friend, independent scholar, independent researcher, Mr. Harminder Mann here with me. And what we're going to do today is I wanted to talk about, it's kind of a tribute, from our side as well on such a special kind of time within the Sikh faith as well. What we wanted to do was we wanted to really talk about who was Guru Nanak. And we hear there's a lot of stories about Guru Nanak Dev Ji. There's a lot of theories about him. There's a lot of interesting facts about him. So what I wanted to do was I bugged my dear friend Harminder tonight and Harry, and I said to him, Harry, let's get together, and why don't we talk about the stuff that you found in your research about Guru Nanak and who he was. And what I wanted to do was, what we were planning to do was kind of go over, who he was, what he did, what was the philosophy behind it, and really also address some of the myths, that we have. And I think this is important. So we have a whole new generation of, Indo-Canadian Sikhs or even, Sikhs from India who have a kind of maybe a limited framework of what the knowledge they get, about Sikh history. So first of all, thank you, my friend, once again for coming in, and really looking forward to tonight. And because I know that you have some really interesting information. So how have you been? How's it going?
Good. Thanks. I'm looking forward to this podcast. I actually spent some of my time at work gathering all my research, and I spent some time today. So this is pretty much what I've been gearing up the whole week for.
Oh, man, this is such an honor. Thank you so much. So, literally, to be honest, the floor is yours. Sure. And I'm just going to ask some questions.
Yeah.
And then we can go from there. And I'm really looking forward just to kind of hearing you out.
Sure.
But let's just start with the obvious question, and really the topic of the podcast is, who was Guru Nanak? And what I mean by that is coming from different standpoints. So we have, obviously, as Sikhs, it's a very, he was our founder. He was the first guru, right? So we have a certain faith, definitely, but maybe even from a secular standpoint. So, because I know you have some interesting, research there. So it's all yours. Go ahead.
All right. You see, this is very interesting. The way we work in this world is things are black and white, good and bad, positive, negative. But what Guru Nanak brought to the world, and it existed before, but what he really brought and he exemplified was living with oneness in a way where oppositions didn't really mean much. So if you had an identity, it was good. Like somebody's skinny, somebody's fat, somebody's built, somebody's lean. But those signifiers weren't enough to make us different. And that's the oneness that Guru Nanak talked about. Now, when I'm going to talk, I don't believe in theisms per se, but I respect the fact that people look at things that way.
Sorry, Harry, one question for you.
Yeah.
Just for our listeners, let's say, who may not understand, can you explain theisms?
Sure. So when I say theisms, I'm referring to people believe that there's a theistic God and that there's a God. You'll hear some people, especially from India, say God means generator, operator, destroyer, right? and it's pretty much
He can do a wicked accent. Eh?
it's the omniscient, omnipotent, all-knowing God. Well, that's what omniscient means. Omnipotent means all that. But the whole point is there's a philosophical God that has now come into everybody's mind. What people don't understand is is that what Guru Nanak is really talking about? That God that people talk about these days came up through philosophers at a much later point in time. It's only in our kind of world because philosophy pushed it so much. It's questions like this that really got me to ask, what was Guru Nanak? Who was he? And are we actually in this day and age trying to fit square pegs into round holes? And that's kind of where I'm going to come with this. So the first question I always ask everybody is, when you think of Nanak, what do you mean? And what do you think about? And the reason why this becomes super important is we're in a world where we look at people who were of starters of religions as people who were sent here by God. Okay, but what was this God that they were sent by? Right? And if that's the case, did they actually say that they were sent by God?
So, I mean, I know you're going to probably get into this later on about the Sakhis. But I think, for example, if you were to say who do you think Guru Nanak Dev Ji is? I think of Sobha Singh in his photo.
Oh yeah, that
right?
Well, where he's droopy eyed and stuff.
Yeah, 100%, right? And I think I would have to say probably a lot. If you were to just say general, like to anyone, whether it's a Sikh or someone who knows, they probably think about that image, right?
So what I do when I actually talk about this, because I've talked about this topic a few times, once here at PAMA, once in Ottawa, around Parliament Hill, I throw out all the images that have been collected of Guru Nanak from the 1700s onwards.
What's the oldest? What is the oldest, by the way, in terms of year?
He looks. It's from the 1700s.
It is from the 1700s,
and it's got Guru Nanak dressed up as a Sufi beer, which means that he's dressed up as one of the Islamic mystics.
Oh wow!
We actually have an account of Guru Nanak going to Jagannath, Odisha, I believe, and when he went there, he had 7 people with him, and they wouldn't let him in because he was dressed in a Muslim cloak. And it turned out that when they found out who it was, they asked for him to come, and he started singing. He went into his state because he would go into a mystic state. I'm going to talk about this in a second. And he would sing from his heart. Often there's a term in Gurbani that says man. People have mistook that to mean mind.
Yeah, that's right. 100%.
Man doesn't mean it. So when they say man jeeta jugjeet,
it means heart?
It means heart.
Couldn't it be though this is a whole different podcast probably, but couldn't man also be a combination of like heart and mind? It's so from what you've seen, it's heart.
It's heart or it's mind.
It's heart or it's mind.
Yeah, and that comes into stuff like grammar. It gets into stuff like context. If the mind is the one that's being brought up, if it's emotions and emotives which are being brought up within the Shabad, like feelings, then it's the heart. Just a tidbit.
Oh, interesting.
But if it's talking about your doubts, then it's and if it's talking, sometimes when it's talking just about your thoughts or you going down a rabbit hole of negativity, then it's that. So the question I usually do is I put up that picture and I say, what's Guru Nanak? These are all imaginations. And I always say this very boldly. Everybody has an imagined Guru Nanak. But what do we know
Well said.
What do we know about Guru Nanak and why is Nanak as a name really important? And that's what I'm going to go into in just one second.
So just for our listeners, Harry, what Harry has done is he has a whole presentation that he's presented on Parliament Hill, PAMA, and various other organizations on Guru Nanak. So we're very lucky that he's bringing his research on the podcast.
So Guru Nanak started off with a topic of Ik Omkar. Ik Omkar, Ik Omkar. It's just a semantic issue there. or how people pronounce it. Unfortunately, that's been transcribed in English as there's one God. But if you look at Ik Onkar, there's no translation for there. There's no translation for is, and there's no concept of God in there. Ik Onkar means oneness, which is manifested.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and that
wow, that's pretty cool.
yeah, and that oneness that's manifested has come from itself. So it's the oneness is manifested out of itself. Up until Guru Prasad, it's an explanation of that. And Guru Prasad there is actually a quality of it.
Wow.
What's happened is people, it's like anything. You take any sport, let's just say, for example, you love MMA. Anybody who watches MMA will realize these people are gentlemen. But people who don't understand MMA are going to think that it's a brutal version of wrestling, where it's all about breaking bones.
Yeah.
But MMA is MMA, regardless of how you look at it. You put somebody into an arm bar, they're in an arm bar. Whether I think the guy's a gentleman, right, playing polo afterwards, or whether you think that the person's a savage, that's what we projected onto it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to clear a lot of that up. So let's start off with Guru Nanak's name. Nanak, and it's important because word and voice is going to be something I'm going to touch upon a lot today. Nanak defined all the words that he spoke about. And it's defined within Gurbani, and then he's opened it up so that when people read, they can come to their own definition based on that scope. That has been called Bhavanakari, 52 letters.
Yes, I've read some of that. So he basically defines each letter in a mystical way.
In a mystical way, yeah. Exactly. He's giving the language its own voice. You brought up Janam Sakhis earlier. I'm going to get into that just in a second. But let's go back to what Nanak means. Nanak actually means without duality. It means completeness. It's completeness without pain. And Nanak means within everything. It's latent as a transformative agent of peace. If you look at this is not something I've come up with. It's what I've translated from by Nandlal, from Kavi Santokh Singh, and Tara Singh Narotam. These are three people who were scholars of different times who had some links, possibly Tara Singh Narotam and Kavi Santokh Singh had some sort of, they were in and around the same time. But Bhai Nandlal was a court poet of Guru Gobind Singh, who was spectacular at Arabic. They say his translations of the Quran at that time had most of the people of Muslim backgrounds in awe. And he himself was from a Hindu background.
Now, a little tidbit. So Nanak actually, doesn't Nanak also appear in the ancient Shastras and the Vedas and stuff? Or the ancient texts? So, again, I've heard this.
I know. I've heard it too. And the problem with it is when you look at the ancient texts, it's like you want to get into a gold mine and you've got one or two tools. Are you going to use drills or are you going to use picks? That also depends on whose grammar you're using. So if you're using Bhartrihari's grammar, it's one thing. If you're using Panini's grammar, it's another thing. So this is where the differences come in. That's why people have been able to look at Sanskrit slokas. And I don't know enough about Sanskrit to really be an authority on it. But from what I have come across and read, this is where the differences come in because people then put their bindings in different areas. This is why when you look at people who propagate religion will always, or faith, why I say religion, I'm going to keep the Guru Nanak and the Sikh I talk about out of religion today. Okay, just throw all that out. We're talking about an individual. I'm going to go into his qualities, but I want to go into the name because Nanak is actually, whenever Guru Nanak is saying Nanak, it's referring to a state that in this state of mind, this is what I see. Guru Nanak, and I'm going to say something that's going to seem blasphemous to many, but for today's podcast, please humor me. Guru Nanak didn't teach anybody anything. There's no proof that he taught anybody anything. His writings show he hasn't taught anybody anything. When people tell me that, wow, I've got a good heart, that's them projecting what they feel they are onto what they feel religion is or what they feel spirituality is. When people say, I am a good person, there's no concept of a good person within Gurbani because you don't have a series of commandments or ethics or some type of theological standpoint that you have to go by. In today's language, I'd say you're either woke or you're not. And if you're walking towards the path of being woke, you're what they call gurmukh. And when Guru Nanak is talking about it, it's a self-reflection. Guru Nanak is referring to his state, his experience in this life, and his poetry is about that. But you're going to wonder, who is this Guru Nanak? What was he about? I'm going to go into a little bit about who he was and what he did, but it won't be your typical, okay, he was born here, this, that. You can find that on the internet. After that, I'm going to go into 3 sources of history, because the imagined Guru Nanak is an imagination that's come through 3 to 4 different interactions with different groups of people. It's like you have 2 things collide and something new comes out of it. It's like species. You have one type of animal mating with another animal, and then you'll see it with people who breed horses, dogs, etc., and you have a new hybrid. After that point, the trajectory's changed. I'm going to get into that a little bit. And so that being said, I'm not going to claim any antiquity here. I'm just going to share throughout this journey of us trying to understand what Nanak is, what certain points that we can pretty much agree on or look at or pay attention to that we never did before.
So here, just for clarity as well. Yeah. So basically what I've understood what you said was, when you're talking about the name Nanak, what you're saying is the name, his name itself, and when he talks about it in Gurbani, is basically when he reaches a certain state and what he sees or experiences.
Pretty much, yeah. So it's like me saying to you, let's just say, Dave, let's say I was a pro bodybuilder. And you said, Harry, I worked out in the gym with you. What is it? What got you to your state? And I'm going to be like, what state are you talking about? Pre-competition? Post-competition? Off-season? What Guru Nanak does is he does a self-reflection of what he sees of the world and then shares it from the final state that he's at that peace, where he's at that non-duality. Because that's his state. His fundamental point is there's a oneness that manifests itself. I'm with that oneness. He doesn't say he is that oneness. I'm going to get into all that in a second. But why I want to bring this up is there's a historical Guru Nanak that we talked about, and you said it beautifully at the beginning, the religious one. And I said, okay, secular is a way of saying it. I'm going to share the so-called secular point of view, but then I'm going to go into 3 histories, and it's going to help share a bit of a view, and then some of the questions that we've talked about at earlier times, we'll get into. So just jump into it at that point. Don't mind me. There was a lot for this one. I didn't want to screw up. I didn't want to miss any points.
No, that's good. That's good.
Right? So when people think of Guru Nanak, they think of a guy with a flowing beard, yellow turban, with a staff in his hand, looking like a nice cartoon character with an old man.
Well, it pretty much looks like Moses with a turban.
Exactly. And that's what it was intended to be.
Right.
Which is okay, because that was the interaction with Christianity where pictures of Jesus became popular, which is actually contrary to how Sikhs were perceived during the times of the Gurus. And I'm going to give you sources from that time to share that. So, first and foremost, Guru Nanak was a linguist. Why do I say he's a linguist? He was a person who traveled the breadth of India, and he went as far as the Vatican, went through Afghanistan, went through Tibet. Even now, every year, there are a group of Tibetan monks that come and pray at the Golden Temple, the Darbad Sahib in Amritsar. I say Golden Temple because people are familiar with that. But it's the Darbad Sahib, which means the court. And there's a purpose why they call it a court. And that's when we get into Kartarpur, I'll go into that a little. But when they come, they pay their reverence because they attribute a miracle of a lake showing up to Guru Nanak. And they said...
what showing up, sir?
A lake.
A lake, okay.
In an area that a dried area, had a lake come up because Guru Nanak hit his staff. What's interesting is
and that was in Tibet.
That was in Tibet. Similarly, in Nanak Jita, which is in Karnataka, south of Hazur Sahib, that whole area up until the 60s was barren land. But everybody would go to the Gurdwara, which is Nanak Jita, to get their water because Guru Nanak put his staff in the ground and the water came. And people who were there in the last 80, 90 years, to them, they knew that their water source was Guru Nanak. That's what he was attributed. So
The Tibetans, don't they have a name for him as well?
Nanak Rinpoche.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay,
Now,
interesting.
there's something that's gone out these days talking about all these different names for Guru Nanak. I just got to let you know, most of them you can't
Verify?
verify. Yeah, like
But Nanak Rinpoche is legit?
is legit. Yeah.
Wow.
And the Dalai Lama has spoken about it. The Dalai Lama comes quite frequently to
Wow.
the Golden Temple and pays reverence. And because of his stature, people are extra warm towards him.
Was there any dialogue between the Tibetan monks and Guru Nanak? That's been noted?
Not that I know of. I've heard of things being said, but the problem is sometimes people will take apocryphal, which is stuff that hasn't been verified, but could potentially be there to draw a point out. And that's something that happens in academics, which is, it's like half-truths, if you know what I mean.
So before, we can't gloss over this because this is huge.
Yeah.
So Guru Nanak visited the Vatican.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty crazy. What proof do we have, or what's the story around that?
Well, there's a gentleman, I think his name's Harminder Singh Kasoor. He has some very interesting theories. There's some intersection in where we kind of agree. He's been able to go to the Vatican and have somebody that the Pope has mandated as an authority validate that Guru Nanak had visited, because there's an Ikonkar etched in outside one of the buildings. And
Really?
There's a talk, yep, and there's a talk. He's taken a picture of it. It's very weak. I wish the picture had less of him and more of the actual Ikonkar in it. But this is something that has been known, and the documents talk about a person coming from India at around the time of Guru Nanak's Udasis with a musician, which would have been Mardana.
How did they communicate?
So this gets into another aspect of it. Being a linguist, in India, you spoke Hindui. Hindui was a language which was common throughout India. If you talk to anybody from India right now, Hindi is the language that
Or Hindustani, isn't it?
Hindustani. Yeah, Hindui was like a version of that, but it extended all the way from Afghanistan all the way down to Sri Lanka, and people would be able to communicate. Trade routes came from all over the world.
That's right, like the Silk Route.
Yeah. So if I were to sit there and say, I can give you a fantastical story about Guru Nanak being able to speak every language, but I can't stand behind that because that would just be a theory.
Okay, interesting.
But who knows what language they were able to speak in? How do we know with the conquests of...
Could have been Arabic too, right?
Exactly. That's what I was going to get to, because Arabic has spread all the way through Spain.
That's right, to Spain. And Arabic was a key language of commerce for the Silk Route.
Right.
Fascinating.
So it could have been that. Right?
So did Guru Nanak Dev Ji meet the Pope of that time, whoever it was?
I don't know.
Or it could have been...
I don't know, but put it this way, the value of what the Pope was to Catholics at that time is how a Portuguese priest who'd come to India to convert people in the 1500s, who bore witness to Guru Arjan Sahib's not hanging, but his death, he referred to Guru Arjan as the Pope for the Indians. In his writings, he said a Pope figure for the Indians has been executed today.
Wow, interesting.
He could have said a minister. He could have said a bunch of things.
So that means when Guru Arjan Pacha was on Tati Tavi, right? When he was, right?
Yeah, and that in itself has many different...
Okay. We'll stay. Well, that's another podcast. But sorry, go ahead.
So I'm gonna give you a list of everything that Guru Nanak, every quality that Guru Nanak exhibited. So I said oneness manifesting. The one thing in Guru Nanak's reflections is virtue or quality is something that gets you close to that oneness. Because when you recognize virtue and quality, you'll get to its source, which is that oneness. And what we see in people are, I'm not saying virtue, vice. I'm talking more like quality, identifier. Because all the identities put together, like let's just say, for example, united. How do we look at it ourselves? We've got our own self-image. People at work look at us differently. Our kids look at us one way. Our family looks at us a different way. We have multiple personalities all the time. We just switch hats all the time. But even if you were to take all that, multiply it, you still can't get to the source. And then you see the infinitesimal way that it manifests, because you're manifesting as different things at different times. And the only thing that's really, anybody who can discern will say this is a quality that's being used now. This is a quality that's being engaged with now, right? So I'm going to give you jobs or titles that you could have given Guru Nanak. He's a linguist. He spoke languages, many, many different languages. He was able to communicate with the common folk of all different places, as well as the most learned folk, and speak to them in the vernacular they understood.
Or the language. Now, let me guess some of the languages.
Yeah.
So it would probably be, I think, Sanskrit.
Well, yeah, but it wasn't spoken.
Well, but he knew Sanskrit as a language. Persian.
Yes.
Arabic.
Yes, although we don't have Arabic Gurbani.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what other languages? Or those are...
Those would be
those are the main
ones, yeah. Other than that, it'd be dialects of those languages.
Okay, interesting.
Right? He was a traveler. We talked about that already.
Okay, so I saw a poster. Yeah. I saw a poster in the Gurdwara, I think made by some of our friends, that talks about. Is this a fact, by the way? I mean, they had a poster, and I'm assuming it's a legit fact. But the fact is, they're saying Guru Nanak was
the second most traveled person.
Yeah, second most traveled person in the world.
So your friend sitting in front of you is the one who made that poster.
Oh,
so it was. Yeah,
oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
No, I was thinking about someone else as well. I guess he was working with you then.
No. I that particular poster I gave Harjot, our buddy Harjot.
Oh, Harjot. Okay, okay.
He actually put all the posters.
Okay. So this is great.
To him. But I was actually the source of
that. So anyone in the GTA who goes to Dixie Gurdwara, you'll see some really cool English posters of Sikhism in general, but there's one of Guru Nanak and his travels, and our dear friend here who you're listening to, Harry Mann, is the one who did the research.
Yeah. So what happened is, on that one particularly, it was from a 1968 Reader's Digest.
That's right. Okay, I now remember. Yeah, that's actually at the bottom of the poster.
So everything I try to do, I reference.
So 1968, Reader's Digest.
Reader's Digest. Yeah, that's the source.
Wow.
So he's the second most traveled, and it's funny you bring that up because that was the one poster some people had contentions with, because people who have a religious bent of mind, and I'm not saying it's good or bad, don't want to see anybody above the person who they believe is their preceptor.
Yeah, what's interesting is, so I don't know if this is a part of the poster or this was in discussion. So so that poster shows that out of all the explorers or whatever, he was the second most. The first one was Ibn
Arabi.
Yeah, Ibn Arabi.
Who himself was a mystic.
He also was was he from Turkey? He was from one of those like
Spain or Turkey.
He was a Sufi.
Yeah,
I remember he was a Sufi. But besides that, we gave Guru Nanak Dev Ji like a number one in the standing of any kind of like prophet we know of.
But you see, that's the problem,
right?
It's because we see him as a prophet, but Ibn Arabi would have been the same attestation,
same caliber, same caliber.
And I'm not saying that brings Guru Nanak down. I mean, we say Guru Nanak, Guru Angad, all of them share the same light. But reality, if you were to look at it, you have the gurus from different ages. They express different qualities. Those identifiers don't negate the validity or how important or what state of mind anybody else was at.
Well, I mean...
But the problem here is that people, especially now, they like hiding behind the greatness of their preceptor. And I say hiding behind because there's this implicit faith that we push in religions to say, if you follow this person 100%, even if you believe in them 100%, you're saved. What are you being saved from? That seems like another noose to me. It's just, it's a person just leaving themselves a little bit of rope. Sorry, before I had that cough fit, I was talking about faith. I said, let's make faith secular here. If a person is trying to achieve anything in life, you have to have faith in what you're doing. Because if you don't believe what you're doing, you're never going to see the fruit of it. Because your own lack of belief will be your biggest stumbling block. I believe that when Guru Nanak, and this is how I read the Gurbani, which are his words or his verses, they're all about that self-reflection. Now, only a person with experience can really talk about that. We know he was a linguist because he was very well learned. He actually came from a very prominent family. He was working as a granary officer for the governor of Lahore, which was considered to be one of the most powerful states in India at that time. He had access to the largest library in South Asia, to the point that Lodi, who he worked for, Daulat Khan Lodi, it was mentioned by the person who beat him, Babur. That's the nickname given to him. That wasn't his real name. Babur was his title. That he actually took over his library. It's been noted. Like, that's how big of a thing his library was. Guru Nanak had access to that for years. I'm going to go into an interesting story about that later. But here's the person who actually lived in the world, who actually lived a normal life with normal jobs. But he was a linguist. He was a traveler. He educated. Now, what I mean education, I don't mean he's proletizing or he's teaching people. All he did was sing and reflect. And it's like when you listen to a song now, those songs where you can actually feel the emotion, it hits our heartstrings. That's the way Guru Nanak sang. And that's the way his stories are that's the way he's been described by religious and non-religious alike.
What I found interesting is when I've talked about Guru Nanak to people, I often say that, because of the interfaith work I do, I believe because of his extensive travels and different communications with different people across the world, he was probably the first interfaith kind of person who kind of, through his own experience, and then talk to the Tibetan Buddhists or the Siddhs of the Himalayas to the Sufis, right? And that's really fascinating because when you look at religion over time or religious figures, normally it was like, for example, you got Abraham, Moses, and all that. They were in that area, right? They didn't go beyond that. Even Jesus, right, was in that area. Then you go to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and then you have him within Saudi Arabia and all that. But here we have Guru Nanak, who actually crossed everything.
You're talking about people who interact with the 12 tribes of Israel, but there are whole other civilizations out there. Guru Nanak didn't limit himself. Unfortunately, the Sikhs of today have limited him. And that's the reality.
Interesting.
And they've limited him to a linguistic base. They've made him into a religious figure. And like I said earlier, people are hiding behind him. And I'm going to be as blunt as I can be about that. Because until you actually see the person for the qualities they exhibited as per how they describe things, it's fine. Like I'll say to people, find me where it says be a good person. Find me where they actually talk about God. We are imposing our own words of God and our own ideas of what God is and our own ideas of what Guru Nanak was based on this. But I'm going to share a few things from early historical texts which aren't actually used in the current narrative of Guru Nanak. But before I do that, I'm actually going to go through everything else Guru Nanak was. So I mentioned linguist, traveler, educator, writer. He actually used an old script and mandated it. So some people say it happened in the second Guru's time. What we tend to forget is that Guru Nanak and the second Guru's time overlapped even when Guruship was given. Guru Nanak was actually still around while Guru Nanak's light went into Bailerna. And out of respect, when they talk about Japji Sahib, which is the canonical, that's the main theme, Shabad, which I'm trying to think of the English word, but it's pretty much the main prayer. And that's
Could you say it's the essence?
The essence of
Gurbani?
The essence of Gurbani, yeah. And I think everybody agrees that the essence of Gurbani is Ikon God.
Because it's the first one.
It's the very first one.
It's the very first.
And it's one of the only ones which it isn't really sung when people have sang it. There have been references that it was supposed to be in Rag Asa, which means the Rag of Hope, which is the feeling of hope, but it's not been written in the title, meaning this is beyond all of that. This is full non-duality. It's not the means of getting a motive to get to a certain state or a certain feeling, so it impresses that way upon your mind. He was a musician. This is the part that people often forget. Guru Nanak took the music that was sung in the courts We're talking like orchestra level type of music, classical music, and he made it accessible to the masses. He even added to it. Now, this is where learning as a system needs to be brought up anywhere. If I wanted to learn anything about MMA, Dave, and you're the person who can authorize it, I would have to prove to you that I've been able to listen, adapt, and fully mimic what you can do, and then break beyond that so that I'm almost one with what you've taught me. It's only after that point can I go further and develop it further. It's not just a subscription. That's what Guru Nanak had done when it came to music. He took the music that was sung in courts, that was sung in like practically classical music, and he brought a folk element. And his musical genius was such that Rag Tukari, which you can't find prior to Guru Nanak, is now part of the Indian classical music genre as one of their scales or rags that you sing in.
Now, was that an outcome of his privileged kind of position? Like, was that like to be able to have access to, because of how you said that he was he came from a good family.
So one thing about learning at that time, that there are about three things that you could learn at that time when you go to any type of school, regardless of your denomination: language, some sort of mathematics, and the third would be music.
Oh wow! Okay. And this was regardless of
your background.
Right, so, like class or...
Well, yeah, class did have an effect on him. This is why Guru Nanak needed to create his own script. Guru Nanak created his own script so that he wouldn't have to be bound to the people. It's called hegemony, the people who control how education gets dispersed. By him creating his own language, he determined who it's accessible to. With the way Sanskrit was at that time, Brahmins could speak, write, and listen. People, the Kshatriya Varan, which were the warriors, could listen. Everybody below that didn't even have the right to listen. And even up until today, there are talks of people who've been a very low social class hearing Sanskrit and lead being poured into their ear. That happens up until today. Because that's...
Today?
Yeah.
This like 2019?
Yeah, we're talking about 10 years ago. It happened in some part of India.
Wow.
I'm referring more to the fact that these things still occur in these ways of doing things is still like common, more common than we'd like to believe. On the other side, if you want to learn Persian or Arabic, unless you were from the class of people that Guru Nanak's family belonged to, you weren't really allowed to learn. And if you did learn, there's an expectation that you would convert.
Interesting.
Guru Nanak's point wasn't to convert anybody or bring anybody into underneath them. He was there to bring everybody to an understanding of that oneness. Sovereignty was given right from the get-go. He lost himself in his next student. When he gave his light, as they describe it, that's what happened. But there's more to that, what that light means. We may get into it today. If not, it's another one. He was a social activist. From his state of being woke, he spoke against discrimination against people. When he actually went to the Vatican, he spoke against slavery. Remember, he was a granary officer. He knew where the grains came from, how they got shipped in, what boats they got shipped in on. Some of those boats were also the same boats that slaves were being brought and shipped.
Wow. Now, where did these slaves come from?
Africa?
Africa mainly?
Africa. There are other places. Wow. Slaves were taken from all
over.
Yeah. We think about slaves as just being people of color, but in North America, Irish were the first slaves. So slavery was something that was just done with impoverished people. And the sad part is, even up until today, some people believe that there's a religious right that if you're a believer in something, that slaves are actually subordinate to you. I mean, to the point that some people who keep slaves, like in London right now, there are people from a certain background who actually go to poorer countries, grab people from the same type of backgrounds, although they may not speak the same language, but they have the same faith. And they use their religious faith to sit there and justify.
To justify them. Wow.
Yeah. In a country where you've got laws which are there to help people.
Well, the pinnacle of the Western world, right?
Yes. So Guru Nanak spoke against that. He created a language. He set it up such that the first person who actually took care of a dharamsal was his place where you could actually congregate. Now they call them gurdwaras, but it was actually a female. And one of them was actually a prostitute who was known at that time. But she became woke, showing that the lowest of the low in society have access to this. It isn't for the privileged.
Oh, wow.
It's for the ones who are ready and worthy. Otherwise, what tends to happen often, you have a preceptor in any faith, you have a few people who are around them, they feel like they're privileged. And if they're not sure, they scratch each other's back and everybody starts believing the same lie.
And now,
why I'm going to that is that's essentially the state of what happens to people when religion or a faith gets codified. Because as soon as it gets codified, it becomes an us and them. Guru Nanak erased that. Well, Guru Nanak, again, I'm going back to the Ekam God, that oneness manifest. It's pretty much saying, all your identifiers aren't significant of themselves. This is going to come up in something I'm going to share. He was an intellect. He was a political activist. He was a swordsman. We have proof that there was a sword that he carried with him. He was
a warrior? Like he practiced like martial arts?
Yeah. Wow. He was an officer. He was actually, the title was Modi. Guru Nanak's title was one of a Modi.
Interesting.
Yeah. That was because he was a granary officer. He was a mayor. This is the part people don't seem to understand. But I want to go into this for just a minute, because if I don't, what the successive gurus were won't make sense. At that time, according to Mughal records, or according to I shouldn't say Mughal records, but according to records kept by the administration, regardless of who was in power at that time, you could start a city or a town of your own if you had a court or darbad as the center, you had water flowing, and you had at least one fruit that you could say was grown in your area, so you have something for commerce. 120 years ago, 150 years ago, and I actually implore people who are listening right now, talk to your grandparents or their great-grandparents. They'll tell you, you'd go to this gurdwara and you'd get an apple. You'd go to that gurdwara and you'd get an orange. Because remnants of what that actually meant still carried, but people have forgotten what made it important. That's why it's not Harminder, because it wasn't really, God doesn't have a place except everywhere and in everyone's heart. But it was actually the Darbad, because that was the court. On that note, we talked about the Vatican earlier. The Amritsar area during the sixth Guru's time had Vatican-type status. If you were on that, it was neutral land, as given by the government. You can only do that if it was a township of its own. That's why you hear stories of the king trying to give land to create the township. Why is this important? Because later on, those land holdings became larger, and now they were no longer mayors, they became kings. So when Guru Gobind Singh, the 10th Guru, has a plume on his turban, which is the sign of royalty, and he had the fly whisk, which they call Jod Sahib, which you see over Guru Granth Sahib. Whenever you had kings come together, everybody had a plume, everybody had a jod going over him or a fly whisk going over him, so that everybody else in the audience would know who the kings were. These are signifiers, so you can spot out who the main people were. What's happened is now it's turned into, oh, he was a king, he's a Kalgiwala. That's what they call Guru Gobind Singh. But they don't seem to understand how it actually built up to that, and the fact that that was his job. There's actually evidence that Guru Gobind Singh had actually gone to the mandir as a king and accepted a plate or given them armored plates and did donations. People are like, oh, that doesn't sound right. Well, for your job, you do what your job is.
So a lot of cultural context, like a lot of social cultural context.
Yeah, so that's why when people put on plumes right now, it doesn't sometimes make any sense because they don't even understand the context behind it. Just because I put a plume on my turban, if I had a turban, doesn't make me a king right now.
And this system, so you're saying this system started with Guru Nanak?
It started with Guru Nanak because, and this is, I'm going to break something else. There are a few Gurdwara or dharamsals which were started, Kartarpur being one of them. That was the land that Guru Nanak had acquired where he created his own city. It went by the rules that Guru Nanak had established. The next one that started was Khadur Sahib. Now people always ask, well, why didn't the second Guru stay in Kartarpur? The Gurus were fully conversant of the laws around him. Their sons were the ones who were titled heirs to it. That's why Baba Siri Chand, who was his son, took over Kartarpur. And even up until today, his Gurdwara Kartarpur is what people know.
Wow, fascinating.
So I'm going to just go down this list. He was a military strategist because when Babur was coming in, he was actually guiding people on how to defend themselves.
Really?
Yes.
What's the evidence of that?
It's in the Jaram Sakhis. It's something Pratan, B41, and I believe Balal kind of refer to. He came from a military background. He had access to all this knowledge. You actually see it in that Nanak Shah Fakir movie. There's when he's coming back on the boat and you see everybody being killed. He was the person behind saying, this is how you guys need to protect yourselves. Because he had the knowledge.
Oh, wow.
Why this type of stuff is also important is you'll hear a lot of the farmers in the 5th Guru's time took to Sikhism. Or took to, I'm not going to say Sikhism because it didn't exist as that at that time, but took to the Guru's teachings. The question is why? Well, at that time, the Guru petitioned for the farmers because there's a drought time. One thing that's not known in normal narratives is that the state actually gave Guru Arjan a medal at that time, or like an honor because he created a water base at a time of drought, which is Taran Sahib, and people would go there and get their water at the time of drought. So it was seen as Guru Nanak doing something for nature, sorry, not Guru Nanak, but Guru Arjan doing something for nature, doing something for society, and that was his social work. Guru Nanak himself was a farmer, and he was a preservationist. These are all things. He had a companion that we know was with him most of his time. His name was Mardana. He was a Muslim by faith, but they were friends. He was the person who sang. His background, caste background, is what they called Marasi. They were usually called to weddings, to officiate.
They were entertainers, right? Like entertainers, musicians.
But they're also the ones who kept the tradition of singing and music around them. Guru Nanak actually had a rabab. It was his sister, Bibi Nanki, who got a rabab by Franda, who's a luthier, meaning a creator of rabab. And they created one which was unique for Mardana, so that when he accompanies Guru Nanak, because Guru Nanak would get into these states, and he would say, Mardanya Rabab Shir, which would mean, Mardana, the voice is coming to me. Now, people looking at this in these days may say, was it a form of schizophrenia? Was it whatever? No, it was a state of non-duality where Guru Nanak's identity was no longer significant. He was one with the one. And he sang from that state.
So let me ask you this question, and you may address it, addressing it later on.
Sure.
The experience that he had,
Yeah.
in popular Sakhis or what we hear, he went into the water for 3 days.
Excellent. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah.
Okay. So is that, first of all, I have a few questions. One is that a legit story? A. B, is that experience of oneness, and then that how did, because I know that the Sakhis or the stories we hear throughout his life showcases divinities in certain ways.
Sure.
But was it that one experience of 3 days in the water that is it a legit story?
This is what I'm going to get to, and this is where people are going to find what I'm about to say challenging yet interesting. Guru Nanak, let's say Guru Nanak spoke. His words were his experience. And let's say you and I heard it. And then we went ahead and we started speaking to his experience. As time went on, that would change. If Guru Nanak was speaking to both of us, we're both going to pick it up slightly differently.
The telephone game.
The telephone game. Bingo. The Janam Sakhis were less about Guru Nanak because they weren't meant to be hagiographies, which means stories about somebody religious. A lot of the texts that were earlier would actually bring up stories, and they'd go just so people would understand that these aren't meant to be history. Guru Nanak would be meeting people who were around thousands of years ago. The purpose wasn't to sit there and say this is our history. The purpose was to understand how the Gurbani fit into a story. So the Janam Sakhis, which were stories of Guru Nanak, were less about Guru Nanak and more about the Gurbani speaking to the reader through its own voice. Because the concept of Shabad is something that people have taken from Gurbani and just ran off with it, either given it some type of perfunctory role. Oh, yeah, we believe in Shabd Guru Surtan Jilla, which means we believe that the Shabd is a Guru and the voice or the noise is the Ton, which is the sound, is the Jilla, meaning the Sikh. They misinterpret that. And why I say misinterpreted is because they haven't looked into, there hasn't been enough collective courage into that in this day and age. In earlier narratives, there were. And what those earlier narratives did was it was these stories, and this is getting right to my next part. These stories called Janam Sakhis are the basis for all of Guru Nanak's history today. But what's happened is they've gone through many lenses, and they've gone through how Guru Nanak should be based on different points in time.
So interesting point you made. What you're saying is that the Janam Sakhis are more about a message of Gurbani versus Guru Nanak, but the stories themselves are being used as descriptions of Guru Nanak, which in reality it's not about Guru Nanak. It's more about the message of Gurbani in a story.
It would be the context of Gurbani outside of what you would think that Guru Nanak or some other preacher is saying. It's another way of giving voice. Because you put yourself, when you're reading the story, you put yourself as a viewer of that situation. You're now witnessing it. But what is the person? Guru Nanak represents, like I said, a state of non-duality. So in that state of non-duality, how do those words and the metaphors that are in those stories, what are they referring to? More often than not, you'll find them referring to the actual Shabad that's there.
So it's interesting. We talked about this a little bit, and I definitely want to bring this up to our listeners as well. Like, remember, we're talking about how, for example, in Hinduism, right?
Yeah.
So you have the Upanishads, you have Vedanta, you have those, the Shastras and all that. And then you have the Purans.
Yeah.
The Purans are the stories.
Yeah.
Right? And, some Hindu scholars and that they'll say that the Purans aren't meant to be literal. They're basically stories for simple people to understand kind of, certain things about creation or whatever. So in the same token, would you say that the Janam Sakhis are kind of, for maybe the masses to understand the message?
Yes and no. When Guru Nanak's message was never one size fits all, how could the stories be that? It was more about the accessibility. Remember, with the Purans, not everybody had access to hearing them either.
Yeah, that's true.
Guru Nanak pretty much said, okay, here are the words, here's the experience. And then at some point in the future, people wrote about it. So I'm going to get to this one question, because you said, was it a metaphor? The 3 days in the river is actually a metaphor of Guru Nanak being in the state of samadhi, which is non-dual experience. So when Guru Nanak came back, and they always say he stuck his finger up and he said, there's no Hindu, there's no Muslim, there's just one. He's just attesting to that truth or reality. Everything on top of that's a construct. Everything we make Guru Nanak is a construct. I just shared about 10.
So he didn't go into a pool? He didn't go into a river?
I'm saying that it's metaphoric.
Yeah, no. I get that.
Yeah.
I get that, but I mean, just at a simple level. So, what you're saying is that again, that story is made, that construct is made, but the deeper meaning is he was in like a meditation, deep meditation.
But to get people to understand what it was, you want to get people to understand your mind ferrying across all its doubts, mind ferrying across all its constructs. When you think of water, why is water being used all the time? Because water was one of the ways that people traveled and they got killed. Waters could be rough. Waters will take your ship down. That's why within Gurbani they'll say the Guru is the ship. But later on in that same verse, the person who's in that state of non-duality goes, yeah, the Guru is the ship, but the Guru is also the water. And the Guru is taking care of it all. So then the question is, what is the Guru? And that is what a person is then thinking about. And it's a very interesting thing because in the Indian tradition, mostly people think of the Guru as just the teacher. Guru Nanak opened it up to, and I'm going to get into this, it's really interesting, the concept of a universal Guru that's been there and always is. So, we got into the Janam Sakhis, which have become primary sources of history. Why did they become sources of history? Because when the colonial interaction happened, so at the time of Guru Nanak, you had Pathans, you had Mughals who came, and they were the administrators. They were the people that controlled everything. Later on, Sikhs had power for a period of time. But then, as soon as the British, from 1650 onwards, as they started swiping through, they took over most of India. Then they had control of everybody who was in a position of power, and they started influencing how people thought. It's part of colonialism. It's not something that's just India's story. It's the story of what happened to everybody in the world.
Yeah, that wherever the British were.
Practically. So then, Guru Nanak had to become a prophet at that time. Guru Nanak had to represent the majority belief, because if you don't find comfort in similarity, you're already too different. So there was a strong movement by those people who'd come from backgrounds where they were actually educated in Persian, like the higher class Sikhs, turned around and appropriated the British system. And I'm not going to give anybody's names here, but you know which scholars I'm referring to, because they're the ones which dictated what a Sikh should be and what the narrative is, and people have referred to them as saints. But in reality, stuff like the poverty that some Sikhs went through was expunged in the texts. Why? Because for Sikhs, here was a text that just by you accepting this third way, you're open to everything. But you've got the Jamsakis, and you've got two other sources that I'm going to go into. So in 1643, in a text called Dabistan, which was written at the time of Guru Har Rai, the seventh Guru, Guru Nanak was brought up. And this is how Guru Nanak was described. It's going to be so different. Now, for all the people who are Sikhs or who are familiar with Sikhism, the way it's been presented today, I'm going to give you a series of events that you've either heard of, but the sequence is very different. Guru Nanak was a Modi, which means he was a person who's in charge of the grain stores. He was practically like a cabinet minister.
Wow.
Okay? Now, This is a growth period for India. You won't believe it, but India was the head of Europe, all of Europe, as per current day Western history. Because India was doing multiple crops at a time, whereas in Europe, there was only one or two crops that were done throughout the year. Mind you, India also has the ability to do it because of the climate. But they were also advanced because they used the seed drill, which the Europeans didn't use at that time. And stuff like cotton, sugar, grains, and citrus fruits were actually being spread through North Africa, Islamic Spain, and the Middle East from India.
Wow.
Why I bring this up is that the term of the use jahaj, which means boat or ship, the one that ferries across, was used a lot by Guru Nanak. He would only know that because he knew where the grains were coming from, where the grains were
So he
going.
traveled, so basically as a businessman, right? Like he would travel.
And he was also aware of the slave trade, which he's actually addressing a lot of times in Good Barney. But because people have seen him as somebody who's only religious and they don't see him as a political activist, they don't see him standing up.
Thanks for tuning in to the Double D podcast. See you next time.